Welcome to week 2 of History 394, Southeast Asia. This is a very short overview lecture this week. So just a reminder, since we're starting on our critiques this week, how I really designed the critiques to convince me of 3 things. Number 1, that you've read the assigned material and understood it and thought about it critically. Number 2, that you know how to find another scholarly source, that you've read it, understood it, and thought about it critically, and included it in your critique. And the third thing is that you know how to cite sources, but you're using at least one in-text note. You can use more. And also how to use and include a bibliography. So just to review from last week, that acceptable sources, scholarly sources for this class include scholarly books, scholarly journals, specialized encyclopedias, such as the Encyclopedia of Asian History, World History Encyclopedia, but not general encyclopedias, government documents and websites, but not general.com, .edu, .net websites, unless they happen to be attached to respectable news sources, which are probably going to come in more handy as we enter into the more modern aspects of this class. Now, this is an example, once again, of what an in-text footnote looks like. If you have any questions, get in contact with me, or please review Week 1, Part 1 lecture. And remember, you need to include a critique bibliography. We're doing this in Chicago or Turabian style. There is a free program, which if you go to this link, will help you put all of your stuff in correct Chicago or Turabian style. And don't forget that before you start working on your critique, that you look at the rubric and see what things are important and how to achieve getting, hopefully, an A. And if you want further guidance, also remember that we have a model critique listed as its own special link on our class Blackboard site. Now, last week we talked about unsuccessful civilizations in changing conditions and the idea of implosion. The idea that any civilization could become marked by internal weaknesses, and then you add to that, you couple with that external strengths, and you have a society, a civilization, a nation that begins to implode on itself. And a perfect example of that is given this week as we begin to look at Vietnam, the Vietnam War, and the ramifications and the aftermath of that war. Now, of course, we all know that Vietnam was a colony, part of French Indochina, which included Laos and Cambodia. And we know that Vietnam fell to invaders, obviously, during World War II, and that the fact that the French could not hold on to French Indochina in World War II certainly gave the Vietnamese people confidence in the fact that the French were not as strong as they originally thought they were, and that the Vietnamese would be able to attain their independence. Of course, the French were not particularly excited about the prospect of giving Vietnam its independence, and so we're going to have a civil war erupt. Now, just as we spoke about implosion in the prior slide, we now need to talk about explosion. Whenever wars occur, but especially civil wars, they're not tidy, they're not clean, they don't respect national boundaries, national borders. And they can bleed over and cross over into neighboring nations very easily. And they do so in this kind of explosion process. So the implosion has already occurred in Vietnam in this case. And now it's going to explode, as we'll see this week, into neighboring countries like Cambodia. Well, one of the first things that usually happens in civil wars is that you have refugees. These are people who are absolutely and completely cut off from their old civilization for one reason or another. Very oftentimes, they tend to be the poorest of the poor, the peasants, who are literally being thrown out of the area that they're in because of the incessant warfare. So refugees typically cross over boundaries, borders, into neighboring states. Then you have rebels. Rebels can successfully fight their civil wars from outside their nations, is in this case Vietnam, and they do so by retreating sometimes to the safety of surrounding mountains or whatever in neighboring nations. And then you have the ideology, which can also bleed over, cross boundaries and borders. So in this case, the ideology of communism. And then you have, in a place like Cambodia or a place like Laos, the fear of all of the above. The fear of the refugees, the fear of what ideas they might bring, of the poverty they bring, of the competition they bring for limited resources for their own people, of any diseases they may be bringing, the fear of the rebels and of their ideology, and of the fact that if they bring the war over into a neighboring nation, well then, and they try to bombard that nation, then there's going to be retaliation of some form. The fear that this ideology, this communist ideology, might spread. There is all of this fear, and we see it again and again in civil wars. I think you see it, if you remember back to your world history, in what really is one of the world's greatest civil wars, and that is the French Revolution, and how pretty soon other nations get involved in that. The Civil War itself that we call the French Revolution bleeds into the French Revolutionary Wars, into the Napoleonic Wars, and pretty soon it has affected all of Europe. You don't have to look far in Africa of the late 20th and early 21st century to see similar examples of civil wars that bleed into neighboring countries, especially with refugees and rebels. And certainly you see that happening in the Middle East, and how that has easily spreads from one nation to another, no matter what we're talking about, no matter whether we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian struggle or whether we're talking about ISIS, that is ISIL, or any of the other struggles. So this whole effect of explosion, that again, that civil wars are not tidy, they're not clean, they do not respect national boundaries. Now this week we're going to be reading all about the Vietnam War and also kind of the end of colonization as well. Chapters 7 and 8 in Osborne, which no matter what version you have, edition you have of Osborne, should be the same. However, these other page numbers, what I'm going to try to do for you is go ahead and scan these into a PDF file so that we make certain we're reading all of the same thing. But I won't scan chapters 7 and 8. The Killing Fields is about Cambodia and what happens to Vietnam, Cambodia. And then Catfish and Mandala is a wonderful book by Andrew Pham. And it's a book about Andrew and his family. He left in the 1970s when he was 10 years old with his family as one of the boat people. The refugees literally fleeing by boat, by sea, from Vietnam. He comes to the United States. They move around in different places, finally get to California. And he's growing up and he's trying to really find himself in the world. And so this novel is about many things. Is he Vietnamese? Is he American? Is he a Vietnamese American? What does that mean? And in this intense struggle to kind of find himself and where he fits in the world, he takes a trip to Asia, and he ends up in Vietnam, and he takes a bicycle and goes literally throughout Vietnam and has many different experiences. The book is called Catfish and Mandala, so let's just look at that last idea for a second here. Now, you're going to see that Pham's family really, it was Buddhist, essentially, and so even though his father, later on kind of claims that, he's an atheist, and Andrew and some of his siblings aren't certain what they are, and they convert for a while to Christianity because, someone has taken them on, a church has taken them on and sponsored them in the United States, a Christian church. Still, underlying his whole philosophy and the whole Southeast Asian philosophy and that of his family and his people are the ideas of Buddhism. And Buddhism has really many things associated with it. And at the risk of being somewhat simplistic here, however, we only have 8 weeks to look into all of Southeast Asia, I want to at least underscore 2 of the ideas of Buddhism. One is a more cyclical idea of the world and the universe. And the second is this interconnectedness of the world, the universe, the animals, the plants, the people, and everything in the world and the universe. So if you keep in mind when you're reading Catfish and Mandala, this idea of cyclical patterns, of interconnected patterns, you're going to have jump out at you right away a number of examples, a metaphor, in fact, dealing with catfish. And he's going to bring this up half a dozen times or more. And you are going to see what the cyclical nature and the interconnected nature of the catfish metaphor is. So I'm not going to give it away and spoil it for you. He never really defines what a mandala is. And a mandala is especially popular in Tibetan Buddhism. But in Buddhism in general, there's an idea of having these kind of circles. Here is sort of an example of a Tibetan mandala, which represent really the universe and all of its parts. And so you're going to see here, the realm of the gods, and you're going to see here the afterlife and the human condition and the animal condition and the struggles that all of us have to put up with in life, the disappointments, and usually, very often, it not only represents this mandala, this circle in view of the universe and its interconnectedness, but how we overcome certain conditions, human conditions, in order to attain nirvana, to attain that release from our struggles and that sense of a kind of a peace, of an internal peace. And so keep that in mind, because what really Pham is looking for in Catfish and Mandala, and how are we all interconnected, and how is he a part of the whole, and how does he fit in to all of it, and why does the world work the way it works? And why does there seem to be horrible sadness, but at the same time, wonderful dreams and hopes? And how do you go on after you've experienced the horrible things that his father and he experienced? How do you continue on? How do you wake up each day? And what hopes and dreams do you have for living in this world? So it's a very deep book, but it's also a very colorful and a very fun book. I mean, it reads very quickly. You will be absolutely enamored with it. If you're like me at all, it'll be just hard to put it down, and you may not even be able to stop with that chapter 16, and say, I can't even wait to next week to read the next part of this book. It's that sort of engaging book which just draws you in. So I hope you're inspired by this week's reading. If you have any questions whatsoever, please get a hold of me and let me know, and have a great week.